Okay, you guys are good.
Okay. Greetings all. I'm Angela Giron, and I'm the program director for the Master of Liberal Studies program. And I'm going to, we have an online program, and then some of our face-to-face ground students also engage with them by taking iCourses. So mostly what I'm going to present today is has to do with kind of building online classroom community. And I'm going to share some best practices and tips for engaging your students, pretty much based on what I have done thus far. And then at the very end, something that I'm intending on doing. So next slide. Oh, I guess I can do it too. So, right, so building classroom community. And certainly is very significant when we are teaching remotely, virtual teaching. So next, I guess, okay. I don't think, but this is kind of this first thing is we want to know who our students are in online formats. They come from all over the country, sometimes the world. I've had students that did the entire program while teaching ESL in Japan, or another student that lived in Dubai. So this is my getting to know you, getting to know all about you tip. So what I like to do at the very beginning, and so this is more with like, if you're going to set up and be teaching summer classes or your fall classes, and they're going to be conducted virtually. So you want to start module 1 with what I call a mixer. And it's a virtual mixer. Our courses are not synchronous, they are asynchronous. So they, they kind of start coming in usually right as soon as the Canvas shell opens. And what I have done in my classes, and you can do it any which way you would like, but there's I call it a mixer. It is graded, and I ask specific questions. And they don't necessarily have to do with the course content. They really are just a way to get to know, for the students to get to know each other and for me to get to know them. So next. So I find that to facilitate this sense of classroom community, that this is a vital assignment. So I say hello and tell us a few things about yourself. And in an online course or virtual courses, this is quite important because human connection means a great deal, especially now. Next. So here's some sample questions that I have students answer in this mixer assignment. So I ask, what's moved you the most with your experience in the program? What flavor of ice cream will you find in your freezer? What's your tattoo status? If given the chance, or ever given the chance again, where would you like to travel to? Are you a fan of exotic animals? Are you obsessed with a streaming video, which clearly, as evident on my Facebook page, there's a lot of obsession right now with streaming video and all sorts of things. And then I also ask, what are your plans post-program graduation? I also ask that some people, well, let's go back. Some people are uncomfortable with uploading a photo of themselves. So or some people just enjoy, like a GIF avatar of themselves. So I ask that they include that. That also gives you a sense of personality, by either a photo or their avatar. And I also ask that they respond to at least 2 other of their peers' postings. Okay, next. Now, I think, the professor has got to be in. And so chime in on that mixer. Your students will love to have you and hear from you on the mixer. So respond to each student, and commonalities that you might share. And so individually, rather than just, oh, it was great to know all of you, blah, 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 blah. Each one, do a reply. Maybe you find that you've both lift weights. Maybe you've both traveled to Vietnam, or maybe you both love Neapolitan ice cream. Next. the other thing that I find to be successful is the module or weekly lectures. This is a way to maintain ongoing connection as you build this classroom community. As I was saying, many of our students live, all over the country, but many of them come in for, convocation. And when they cross the stage, they feel like they know me because they have listened to me, talk each and every week through a number of courses as they've gone through the program. And it's kind of interesting. This year, spring, we won't have commencement, but sometimes they, as they cross the stage, they're so excited to actually face-to-face see me that I'll just get lifted and hugged, and it's very nice. So I think that that's important. Now I'm going to go through some tips on these lectures. Okay, next. So unlike synchronous classroom lectures where one can meander, go off topic, maybe such, that kind of world, asynchronous lectures need to be focused and concise. So my suggestion is that you write out your lecture prior to recording and ensure that your lecture for the module week runs no longer than 10 minutes, preferably 7.5 minutes. When possible, you can request an appointment at ASU Online Studios to record. And if you do that, then you send your lectures in 48 hours in advance, the text, so that you can make use of that teleprompter. And that way you're able to, really, let's focus in like they're there because they will be there. And then if you're recording from home, which you might have to do now because I think the studios are closed, use a book stand for your printout lecture that you can refer to. And I'm going to just show you like what I have. This is like a little thing. It's like a cookbook or any kind of a book. And I just put my text there so that if I have to refer to it but the main thing is make eye contact. So, I can be like over here because I know there's a point I want to make and okay, now I'm going to talk about, but I always come back. And so that's really significant. Okay, next. And then further tips on building this classroom community when teaching is remote. Include peer reviewing on some of the assignments. Create lively discussion boards whereby groups and or individual students are able to interact with each other. Next. Okay, now I'm going to get to emails. Too many emails, too little time. And particularly right now, we're getting a lot of emails, and understandably so. But, even in general, at the beginning of a session, there's a lot of emails that come in. So what I think is important is to create very clear guidelines in your syllabi for students to adhere to. So remember, you do not have to be on call 24/7. In your syllabi, clarify for students when they can expect reply to their email. 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever you decide, abide by it. State that you will not respond to emails over the weekend or holidays. This is a good idea. You have to have some me time as well. And I encourage all of my faculty to do likewise. I mean, there are some times where you're going to, where there's really critical situation. But overall, try to abide by that. And also state the appropriate manner by which you wish to be addressed by email. Is it Professor Giron? Is it, Angela? Whatever it is. But what I don't like is, hey. I mean, hey. So, you might want, and if that's already stated in your syllabus or your syllabi, then they're going to abide by it. And also state that the student include the course name that they're emailing about and their first and last names. Too often, I'm in your class, and, it'll say, I'm in your 598. Well, I might have several 598 electives that I'm teaching, and it's very, I need to know what course they're emailing about. And also that they use their respective ASU email accounts when emailing you. Because I'm finding that I'm getting a lot of emails where it's not ASU account. All right, next. Set office hours, online office hours. So they know that, you know, you can, whatever day and or hour, they know that you're there and they can make an appointment. Okay, next. And these office hours now, you know, we're becoming very, very Zoom functioning. So you can use Zoom, you can use Skype. If you happen to have a private cell phone for work, you can use FaceTime. So building relationships with your online and or virtual students are easier now than ever before. And this is something I'm going to start doing. I haven't done this yet, so I'm hoping it will work. So it's Zoom for recruitment and retention. Next. So this is separate from office hours, and it would be a weekly, or I'm even thinking it could be a bi-weekly open forum Zoom meeting, and it could be facilitated by your program director. So potential graduate students can be directed by college advisors and or Ed Plus to join the meeting. These potential graduate students can then ask questions about your program. You can make sure that you send them the handbook if you have one. And also current graduate students in your program can also ask questions of program concerns, as well as voicing their experiences in the program to those who are potential graduate students. And once this is all set up in place, the faculty of your program can make this announcement on Canvas so that the current graduate students are aware that this is a space and this is a Zoom meeting. It's every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And so, you know, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm just getting ready to work with Erica Peters and dealing with how we're going to hopefully make this a success and recruit and retain. And next, that's it. Thank you.
So I'm Stephen Carradini, and I'm in the Technical Communication program, and we teach graduate students online as well. And so we have some ways that we go about teaching asynchronous, which is what we usually do. And then in this particular time, we're dealing with synchronous courses as well that are being taught online. And so if you'll click through the next slide, Nick, we'll talk about how you do content for graduate students. So Angela covered the community aspects of it very effectively, and I'm going to talk about content. And so the main thing that I want people to know when we think about content online for graduate students is that you need to maintain your standards, but you also need to adjust your expectations. And that's because we want to make sure that our online courses have rigor, but we also have to adjust to the realities of the online situation. The online status of our students means something. It's a real aspect of their lives, and it changes the way that they interact with the course and changes the way that they interact with the content. So we don't want to make all of the courses undergraduate level work just because of the online nature of things, but we also want to make sure that we're respecting that there really are differences in both online students and graduate student work. So if you can click through. So first I'll talk about how to maintain standards, and then I'll talk about how to adjust your expectations. And so for those of us who have been switched over to, whoa, I just lost the Zoom. There we go, we're back. Those of you who've been switched over to Zoom and online, both asynchronous and synchronous in the middle of the semester, try to maintain continuity with your pre-online schedule as much as possible. Unless there's a really specific reason that you want to shift, try to maintain the same thing that you were doing as much as possible. Shifting due dates on people can be difficult, and it can be difficult for you as well if you're suddenly juggling different pieces of paperwork that have different dates on them and things like that. So you want to maintain continuity as much as you can. We'll talk about the times that it's not possible in the next slide, but as much as you can, it helps. You want to avoid dropping to undergraduate level prompts. You want to still require students to deal with texts and citations. You want to make sure that they're still working at a graduate level, whether that's master's or doctoral. You want to see that they're engaging with the material at the level at which you would expect if they were in an on-campus class. And so that means giving them prompts that reflect that and are potentially longer and more involved than undergraduate prompts if you teach undergraduate students. You may have to think harder about how to get the information that you want students to get across. So you may have to have more precise questions. You may not be able to ask as general open questions as you may be able to do in a seminar format or in a small master's class. You may have to be more detailed with your questions. You also need to require everyone to continue to contribute equally. So some students love online classes and they would gladly take more of them if they were allowed. Some students hate them and would avoid all of them if they were able to. And so even though there are big changes, you may need to reach out to some students that hate online and sort of coach them through the ability to continue to contribute in a normal way if they're averse to the online environment. Similarly, you may have students who were not as excited about speaking up in class or were not as excited about writing formal documents and sending them to you. They may be more excited about online environments. And so thinking about how you can encourage those people as well and get to know them and their work styles, and while you're connecting with people who may be averse and struggling a little more. And on that note, you should prepare for many long student emails. Graduate students in particular will send you long emails. And this is partially because they're used to having long conversations with you if your class has split in the middle of a semester and gone to online. But even if you aren't in a situation like that, online students, graduate students have deeper connections to the material and often are more motivated to pursue this degree for various professional or continuing on to further grad school ends. And so they may want to talk more, and you may get more long emails than you would at an undergraduate level. And so they will perhaps expect you to have long responses. And so you may be able to handle them better if you know that they are coming. You also may be able to record your responses, and instead of having to type them all out, you can do this in Canvas and in other tools as well. You can record audio responses, and that might be a way to take some of the stress off of you if you suddenly get 5, 6, 7 long emails about involved and dedicated topics. Along those lines, you can mitigate some of the long emails by asking for drafts of work. So many times graduate students want to know if they're on the right track. They're very concerned that they're moving in the right direction. And so asking for drafts is a way that you can avoid some emails by saying, okay, why don't you write that up in a draft and send it to me, and then I'll give you feedback on the draft. Because oftentimes graduate students can spend quite a bit of time writing out emails that they could just put into a document, into a paper, and that sort of concern could be addressed in a text document. So asking for drafts, which you may not do in a on-ground or on-campus course, that can be a way that you can avoid some emails and also maintain standards. So instead of being able to have conversations with students after class or in the hallway, you may have to do them in slightly more formal means by getting drafts from them. And then one thing I do is use announcements liberally. So I like to give beginning of class announcements, but in a online space, that's harder. And I use the announcements to do that. So at the beginning of every week of the course, I'll give an announcement recapping the past week, forecasting the upcoming week. And if there's any individual pieces of news I have to share, I'll put it in an announcement. And so my graduate students get used to the rhythm of seeing me do an announcement once a week, at least. But on the first day of the week is when I do those. And so that keeps the graduate students connected, beyond doing things like responding to discussion posts and things like that. So those are all ways that you can maintain standards of what you previously did, while modifying them to connect with the online situation. Next slide. So with all of that in mind, there are lots of ways that going to online needs to shift what we do. And sometimes you will have to shift your schedule. Sometimes it is required due to technical concerns. Sometimes it's due to personal concerns. You need to move things so that you have a more structured week for yourself, things like that. Be very clear about the reasons that you're doing it. Even if you're saying it will be easier for me to grade things if you turn everything in on Friday instead of if you turn it in on Tuesday and Thursday, let students know about that. Don't just change it without explanation. Students appreciate when you say, hey, I am a real person and I am also in changed circumstances. And so I need to shift the situation. And so just be clear about that, whether you're in a shifted mid-semester situation or in a fully online from the beginning situation. If you change things, let students know. Don't let Canvas be the only person that lets them know through an auto email that their due date has changed. So even though I said require citations, ask them to engage with texts, you may have to change the sorts of texts that you're asking them to deal with. Books may be hard to acquire. Amazon and other sorts of booksellers are struggling to deliver in timely manner. I'm not sure when that will return to regular functioning. The library is also in sort of a different mode of delivery. And so if you rely heavily on books, you may not be able to. The students may not be able to get them. And so you may have to require different types of readings, different journal articles or online readings that are appropriate to the situation. So keep that in mind. Also, spoken and written responses require different levels of thought and time. So when you're in a seminar class with a doctoral student or in a 15 to 20 person master's class, you can ask people to speak extemporaneously and they will come up with quite a number of words. But speaking and writing don't have the same level of thought attached to them often. And so asking someone to write as much as they talk in a seminar course is something that will take a lot longer than if they just speak out loud. So keep that in mind. You may want to ask them to record spoken responses so that you can maintain that aspect of the oral version of your course, or you may just shorten the amount of text that you ask for. So instead of asking for 1,000 words or 800 words, you might ask for 400 or 500 words, something like that. That reflects not a decreased level of thought, but it reflects that there's more time and effort going into writing 400 words than speaking 1,000 words. You may have to flex due dates, especially on major projects. Some classes, this isn't a problem. Students seem to be generally on the ball and they all turn things in on time and there's no problems at all. But some classes seem to have outbreaks of this where suddenly deadlines are incredibly malleable to the student, and you may have to roll with that, especially in a situation if you've been shifted from on ground to online quickly. You may just have to flex a little bit and be more generous with your policies regarding late penalties and such. And I mentioned that drafts are one good way to maintain your expectations, to maintain your standards. But you also have to adjust and say that drafts may look ugly. They may not be very good, especially if you don't usually look at drafts. You may be somewhat dismayed to find the quality of draft writing be very low. That's normal. Think about your own writing. Nothing comes out the first time the way that it ends up in a formal final version. And if we ask students to turn in drafts, then we have to expect that they are not going to be perfect, and that we can help them develop those drafts into better papers. And that is definitely a difficult transition if you're not used to teaching papers or assignments in that way. So looking at drafts and giving formative feedback as opposed to summative feedback at the end. And that there are a lot of resources about how to give productive, formative comments that allow students to build on their work and develop it more. And you can seek those out. But that's one way that you may need to adjust some expectations. And then finally, the most disappointing of all of the suggestions I'm going to make here is that you kind of have to acknowledge that not everyone is going to read what you send them. The comments, the emails, the announcements, no matter what we do, there's always going to be someone that sends you an email about something that you've already said 2 or 3 times. And that's just part of the online experience, is that people have a lot of email coming at them. They have a lot of announcements and comments, this class, that class, another class. And so reacting charitably is difficult at times, but it is, that's part of the adjusting expectations from the online environment, is that we don't have a lot of control over the way that the message is received, unlike in a on-ground face-to-face classroom. So next slide. So as I mentioned in the maintaining expectations, maintaining standards section, some people, when put in an on-ground classroom, don't do very well, and you put them online and suddenly they're great students, and vice versa. So being aware that, especially if you've shifted in the middle of a semester, that some students may disappear. You may have to track them down. Some students may have new struggles they didn't have when they were in your face-to-face class, and you'll have to adjust and seek out how they're doing and catch up with them, which takes time and effort, but it is something that is a function of the online environment, that you will have to, more often than in an on-ground class, reach out and try to make sure that students are staying on track, especially if they haven't turned in an assignment or 2 or 3. But also, students that were perhaps struggling may turn out to be incredible online students, and they may be pleasantly surprising you. So when you adjust your expectations, definitely adjust that you don't know how students are going to respond to the online environment. All right, next slide. So that's really the focus of what I had to say, which is that we want to maintain standards. It's important to recognize that this is still a graduate course, even though it's online. But I've left the adjust expectations headline at the top, because that's one of the most important things to do, is adjust your expectations as you go forward and make sure that even though this is still a grad course, this is still a rigorous experience at ASU, that there are ways that students need our assistance more, and they need it in different ways when we're delivering content in a graduate student environment. So I hope that some of these suggestions were helpful in helping you think about conceptually ways forward. There are other recordings about how to use tools effectively and how to develop various other types of delivery mechanisms through tools like Canvas and Zoom, and you can check those out. But I wanted to look conceptually at how can we deliver online graduate education effectively in this shifted environment, and also for the future when you're just building your online courses from scratch. So thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful.